It's the night of February 10th, 1897. The air in New York City is so cold it feels like a physical blow, a biting crystalline cold that turns every exhale into a plume of white smoke against the flickering gas lights. A line of handsome cabs and electric broughams, the very latest in personal transportation, stretches for blocks down Fifth Avenue. Liveried footmen, their breath misting in the frigid air, rush to open doors for figures emerging in a riot of silks, velvets, and furs. But inside the brand new, impossibly grand Waldorf Hotel, it's another world entirely. 1,000 gas lamps, their flames reflected in 1,000 mirrors, have banished the winter night. They're throwing a warm, honeyed glow on a scene of such staggering theatrical opulence, it feels like you've stepped not just into a party, but into a dream. This is the Bradley Martin Ball, and you're standing in a painstakingly accurate recreation of the Palace of Versailles. The air is thick, almost heavy, with the scent of 4,000 orchids, roses, and gardenias, their heady fragrance mingling with the expensive French perfumes of the guests. You see women in gowns that seem to be woven from light and jewels, their necks and arms ablaze with diamonds, their hair piled high in intricate powdered constructions. You see men dressed as Louis XIV, as Napoleon, as Renaissance princes, their chests glittering with medals they never earned, their hands resting on the hilts of swords they'll never draw. This isn't just a party, it's a declaration, a defiant roar of wealth and power. A statement that the people in this room are not just rich, they are a new kind of royalty. American royalty. And this palace of a hotel stands on a street of palaces, Fifth Avenue, Millionaire's Row. For 2 solid miles from the green expanse of Central Park at 59th Street down into the 40s, a nearly unbroken wall of private castles lines the avenue. Marble chateaus, granite palazzos, and limestone fortresses, each one bigger, grander, and more defiant than the last. These aren't just homes, they are monuments to the colossal, almost abstract fortunes of the Gilded Age. Fortunes built on railroads that spanned a continent, on steel that scraped the sky, on oil that fueled a new world. Fortunes that seemed as permanent and as indestructible as the very stone they were built from. Now, picture this. It's 35 years later, 1932. You're standing on the exact same spot on Fifth Avenue, but the palaces, they're gone. Almost all of them. Vanished, as if they were part of the dream you were just having. In their place are sleek modern apartment buildings and towering department stores. The air is still cold, but now it's filled with the acrid smell of exhaust fumes and the thin, sweet smoke of roasted chestnuts from a street vendor's cart. A man in a worn-out coat, his face etched with worry, shuffles past, his eyes fixed on the pavement. The dream is over. The city is awake, and it's a harsh morning. So what happened? How did this world of unimaginable wealth, this street of stone kingdoms, vanish so completely, so quickly? Ask anyone today and they'll give you a one-word answer: the crash. The great stock market crash of 1929. The day the music stopped, the day the ticker tape became a funeral shroud, and the millionaires, ruined in an instant, threw themselves from their office windows. And that's the story we all know. It's simple, it's dramatic, it's a perfect morality tale of hubris and downfall. But here's the thing. It's not the whole story. It's not even the most interesting part of the story. The fall of Millionaire's Row wasn't a single, sudden event. It was a slow, creeping death that began years before anyone had ever heard the words Black Tuesday. The crash wasn't the cause of death. It was the final, brutal blow to a world that was already dying, a world that was, in many ways, already a ghost. This is the forgotten tragedy of Millionaire's Row, the story of how an empire built of marble and ambition was brought down not just by a stock market crash, but by taxes, by changing tastes, by the simple, crushing weight of its own extravagance. To understand how it all disappeared, we first need to understand the ferocious, obsessive, and uniquely American ambition that willed it into existence. The protagonist of our story isn't a person, it's a place and an idea: Millionaire's Row. And like any great protagonist, it was born from conflict. The Gilded Age, that glittering, turbulent period in the late 19th century, was a time of explosive growth and brutal competition. A handful of men, the Vanderbilts, the Astors, the Carnegies, the Fricks, were amassing fortunes on a scale never before seen in human history. They weren't just rich, they were richer than kings. But in New York, the beating heart of this new America, there was a problem. There was old money. Families like the Astors and the Schermerhorns, who had been wealthy for a few generations, they saw themselves as the city's rightful aristocracy. And they looked down with absolute contempt on the brash, vulgar, new money, the nouveau riche, like the Vanderbilts. The Vanderbilts, who had made their staggering fortune in the dirty, rough-and-tumble world of shipping and railroads, had more money than God. But in the rigid, exclusive, and frankly snobbish world of New York society, they were outsiders. And for one Vanderbilt in particular, that was simply unacceptable. Her name was Alva Vanderbilt, and she was about to declare war. While other members of the sprawling Vanderbilt clan were busy expanding the family's railroad empire, Alva had a different and, in her mind, far more important mission: to conquer New York society. And her weapon of choice was architecture. She would build a house so magnificent, so expensive, so undeniably grand, that the old guard would have no choice but to surrender. Imagine you're walking up Fifth Avenue in 1882. It's mostly lined with respectable but relatively modest four-story brownstone houses, the uniform of the established upper class. And then you see it. At 660 Fifth Avenue, it looks like a fairy tale castle has been dropped into the middle of Manhattan. It's the Petit Chateau, Alva's creation. It's built of pristine white limestone, intricately carved, with turrets and balconies and a steeply pitched roof that seemed to have been plucked straight from the Loire Valley in France. It doesn't just stand out, it screams. It cost $3 million. Let that sink in for a moment. In 1882, that's the equivalent of nearly $100 million today for a single house. And this was just the beginning. Alva's chateau was a shot across the bow, a challenge, and the battle was on. Suddenly, a respectable brownstone wasn't enough. To be a true titan of industry, you needed a palace on Fifth Avenue. The bigger, the better. And so they rose, one after another, in a frenzy of competitive construction, each family trying to outdo the last. William H. Vanderbilt, Alva's father-in-law and son of the original Commodore, built the Triple Palace just down the street. 3 identical mansions connected, taking up an entire city block. Then his other son, Cornelius Vanderbilt II, decided that wasn't big enough. He built his own chateau, a behemoth of red brick and limestone at 57th Street, that was, for a time, the largest private residence ever built in New York City. It had 137 rooms. To put that in perspective, the White House has 132 rooms. The Vanderbilt mansion was bigger than the home of the President of the United States, and it was just one of a dozen Vanderbilt homes in the city. They weren't just building houses, they were building a dynasty, stone by stone, proving their dominance with every block of marble they hoisted into place. Let's take a tour. Imagine you've received a coveted invitation to the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion. You step out of your horse-drawn carriage onto Fifth Avenue. The street itself is a parade of wealth. Liveried footmen stand at attention by massive ornate wrought iron gates. The clatter of horses' hooves on cobblestone is the rhythm of the city. You walk up the grand staircase, the doors swing open as if by magic, and you step inside. The sheer scale is dizzying. You're in a hall of mirrors inspired by Versailles, but on a more intimate, concentrated scale. Light from 1,000 candles in crystal chandeliers glitters on gilded surfaces and polished marble floors. From here, you move into the dining room. It's a 2-story Moorish fantasy with intricate tile work that seems to shimmer and a massive fireplace carved from a single enormous block of stone. Then, into the art gallery, a room the size of a small museum, its walls lined with priceless paintings by European masters purchased in bulk on continental shopping sprees. Every surface is a testament to unimaginable expense. The wood paneling was stripped from ancient European castles. The tapestries were woven for French kings. The ceilings are covered in elaborate frescoes painted by Italian artists brought over just for the job. This wasn't just luxury, this was a performance. a theatrical display designed to awe, to intimidate, and to solidify their place at the very top of the social pyramid. It was a message to the world: we have arrived, and we are here to stay. And the ultimate stage for this performance was the party. Alva Vanderbilt, having built her castle, now needed to fill it with the right people. But the undisputed queen of old money, Mrs. Caroline Astor, whose family had been rich for what passed as an eternity in America, refused to acknowledge her. So Alva planned the party of the century, a massive masquerade ball to celebrate the opening of her new chateau. And then she made her move. She sent out 200 invitations, but deliberately, cruelly left one person off the list: Mrs. Astor's own daughter, Carrie. It was a masterstroke of social warfare. Mrs. Astor's daughter was devastated. She and her friends had been practicing a special dance, the quadrille, for weeks, hoping to perform it at the ball. The entire city was buzzing about Alva's party. To be excluded was social death. Finally, humiliated, Mrs. Astor did the unthinkable. She sent her footmen around to the Vanderbilt mansion. She left her calling card. It was a formal surrender, a white flag. Alva had won. She had breached the fortress of New York society, and her masquerade ball would become the stuff of legend. It cost Alva $250,000. That's over $6 million in today's money. For one night, she spent $11,000 on flowers alone, $65,000 on champagne. Guests came dressed as kings and queens, historical figures, even animals. One woman, Kate Puss Strong, showed her love for felines by wearing a taxidermied cat on her head and 6 more cattails on her gown. Another Vanderbilt sister-in-law came as an electric light, her dress studded with bulbs, holding a battery-powered torch. It was absurd, it was decadent, and it set a new standard for extravagance that the city's elite would spend the next 2 decades trying and failing to top. This was the world of Millionaire's Row. A world of absolute, unshakable confidence, of limitless ambition, a world where men who had conquered a continent now sought to conquer society itself. They had built their empires of steel and stone, and they believed with every fiber of their being that these empires would last forever. They had no idea that the forces that would bring it all crashing down were already in motion. But first, they had to build it. And that would prove to be the challenge of a lifetime. Building a palace on Fifth Avenue wasn't just a matter of writing a check. It was a logistical and artistic undertaking on a scale that's hard to comprehend today. These weren't just houses. They were complex machines for living, designed to be run by an army of servants and to host entertainments on a royal scale. The construction was a spectacle in itself. The architects were the new rock stars of the age. Men like Richard Morris Hunt and Stanford White. They were the first generation of American architects to be formally trained at the prestigious École des Beaux-Arts in Paris, and they brought a European sensibility to the raw, chaotic energy of New York. They would travel the continent with their wealthy clients, sketching French chateaus and Italian palazzos, and, in a move that seems shocking today, buying up entire rooms from crumbling castles to be shipped back and reassembled in Manhattan. A 15th century fireplace from a French monastery, a 17th century ceiling from a Venetian palace, all crated up and sent across the Atlantic. Think about the sheer manpower. Hundreds of stonemasons, many of them recent immigrants from Italy, carpenters, plasterers, and artisans worked for years on a single house. They used cutting-edge technology. The Vanderbilt mansions had electricity, central heating, and elevators long before they were common in even the most luxurious apartment buildings. They even had their own private power plants in the basements, humming away to keep the lights on and the rooms warm. These were not just homes, they were self-contained ecosystems of luxury. But the real challenge wasn't the construction, it was the maintenance. Running a house like the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion was like running a grand hotel for a single family. It required a staff of at least 30 servants, and often more. You had a butler who was the general manager of the household, a figure of immense authority. Under him were footmen, valets, and hall boys. You had a housekeeper who managed the vast team of maids, parlor maids, chambermaids, and scullery maids. You had a French chef who commanded a team of cooks and kitchen assistants. There were laundresses who did nothing but wash and press the mountains of linen all day. There were grooms and stable boys to care for the dozens of horses and carriages. There was a small army dedicated to a single family's comfort, and the cost was astronomical. Just the coal to heat one of these behemoths for a winter could cost more than an average American family earned in a decade. The sheer waste was part of the point. It was a way of saying, we can afford to burn money. And then there was the social pressure, the constant, relentless need to entertain. The Gilded Age was a blur of dinners, balls, and receptions. A dinner for 50 people was a minor affair. A ball for 500 was the standard. And each event had to be more spectacular than the last. This led to a kind of madness, an arms race of absurdity that went far beyond Alva's masquerade ball. There was the infamous horse ball, hosted by the industrialist CKG, Billings. He had the ballroom of Sherry's restaurant, one of the city's finest, covered with sod. His 36 guests, all men, dined on horseback. The horses had champagne bottles strapped to their saddlebags from which the guests drank through long rubber tubes. The cost for this one night of equine insanity? $50,000, that's over $1.3 million today. Not to be outdone, the socialite Mamie Fish hosted a dinner party in honor of a Prince del Drago of Corsica. Her 100 guests arrived to find that the guest of honor was a chimpanzee, dressed in a tiny tuxedo. The chimp reportedly got bored, climbed the chandelier, and began throwing things at the assembled millionaires. Then there was the dinner party for 100 dogs, where the canine guests, decked out in diamond collars, sat at tables and were served a 3-course meal by human waiters. It sounds like a joke, but it was real. This was the level of conspicuous consumption required to stay in the game. It was a glittering, exhausting, and fantastically expensive treadmill. For a few decades, it seemed sustainable. The fortunes were so vast, the profits from railroads and steel so immense, that the money hose seemed to be permanently on full blast. But then, something changed. A quiet, almost invisible shift in the foundation of their world. It didn't come from a stock market ticker. It came from Washington, D.C. In 1913, the United States ratified the 16th Amendment to the Constitution. It was 3 simple sentences that would prove to be a death sentence for the Gilded Age lifestyle. It gave Congress the power to lay and collect taxes on incomes from whatever source derived. The federal income tax was born. At first, it was a minor annoyance. The top rate was only 7% on income over $500,000, but it was a crack in the dam. For the first time, the federal government had a direct claim on the fortunes of the super rich. Then, 3 years later in 1916, came the second blow, the modern estate tax. Now, when a titan of industry died, a significant chunk of his fortune would go to the government before it could be passed on to his heirs. These 2 taxes fundamentally changed the math of being a millionaire. The previously unlimited funds were now, for the first time, limited, and the cost of maintaining their palatial lifestyle was no longer just an extravagance. It was becoming a crippling liability. The Golden Age was over, the clock was ticking, and nobody even heard it. By the early 1920s, the world that had built Millionaires Row was fading. The First World War had shattered the old European order that American high society so desperately tried to imitate. The automobile was replacing the horse and carriage. Jazz clubs and speakeasies were replacing formal balls. The children and grandchildren of the great robber barons didn't have the same appetite for social warfare as their parents. They wanted a different kind of life, one with more privacy, more speed, and less formality. And they were facing a new, terrifying reality: the spreadsheet. The annual cost of running these houses was becoming impossible to ignore. One real estate expert at the time did the math. A mansion valued at $4 million, he calculated, cost its owner $240,000 a year just in lost investment income, the money it could be making if it were invested instead of tied up in a house. That's before you paid for a single servant, a single lump of coal, or a single dollar in taxes. Add in the taxes and the staff, and the annual upkeep, he estimated, was closer to $400,000. That's the equivalent of nearly $7 million a year today, to run one house. Imagine spending almost $20,000 every single day just to keep the lights on and the floors polished. Even for the richest families in America, that was a staggering sum. The palaces had become prisons of expense, and so the great sell-off began. And here is the hidden truth, the part of the story that gets lost in the drama of the 1929 crash. The demolition of Millionaire's Row started in the mid-1920s. It started when the economy was roaring, when the stock market was soaring to unprecedented heights. It started not because of poverty, but because of practicality. In 1925, Alice Vanderbilt, the widow of Cornelius Vanderbilt II, sold their magnificent mansion at 57th and 5th, the largest house in New York. She sold it to a real estate developer for $6.1 million. Why? She said it plainly. The taxes were just too expensive. The mansion was torn down. In its place rose the luxury department store, Bergdorf Goodman. The site of a private palace became a public temple of commerce. Let that sink in. The grandest palace on Millionaire's Row was demolished to make way for a department store. It was a sign of a profound shift in the city's values. Commerce was replacing aristocracy. The age of the private palace was giving way to the age of the public skyscraper. The future of Fifth Avenue was not in private residences, but in retail. The dominoes began to fall, one by one. In 1926, Alva Vanderbilt's Petit Chateau, the house that started it all, was demolished. The same year, the colossal Astor Mansion, the seat of the old money dynasty, was sold and torn down to make way for a synagogue. The symbolism was potent. The fortress of the WASP aristocracy replaced by a house of worship for a new wave of immigrants. In 1927, the home of the copper magnate William A. Clark, a 121-room monstrosity so excessive it was nicknamed Clark's Folly, was demolished. Before they tore it down, the family opened it to the public for tours. The New York Times reported that Charlie Chaplin was among the thousands who wandered its halls, gawking at the excess. It was like touring a ruin before it had even been ruined. People were treating these houses like artifacts from a lost civilization, even while their owners were still living in them. A newspaper article from that year reads like an obituary. Last summer, the Astor Mansion at 65th Street was removed, it lamented. The Phipps house is to go soon. The few remaining houses will soon fall to the hands of developers. The tragedy was happening in plain sight. The great stone ships of Fifth Avenue were sinking, and the lifeboats were apartment buildings and office towers. So, by the time the autumn of 1929 rolled around, Millionaire's Row was already a ghost of its former self. It was a street of ghosts, a collection of memories and empty lots. The world it represented was already gone, but the fortunes that had built it, for the most part, were still intact. The families had moved to sprawling country estates on Long Island or chic, modern apartments on Park Avenue. They were still unimaginably wealthy. They just didn't live in palaces anymore. But their wealth was no longer in stone and marble. It was in paper. Millions and millions of shares of stock, their values soaring to dizzying heights on a wave of giddy, irrational optimism. They had survived the assault of the taxman. They were about to face a different kind of enemy, an enemy that was faster, more brutal, and utterly unforgiving. The real crisis was still ahead. The late 1920s were a party, a nationwide Bradley Martin ball, and everyone was invited. The economy was booming, and Wall Street was the place to be. It seemed like a can't-lose game. Stocks only went up. Stories abounded of chauffeurs and maids getting rich on stock tips from their employers. By 1929, an estimated 25 million Americans owned stock, many of them on margin, borrowing money to buy more shares, using the shares themselves as collateral. The total amount of this borrowed money reached $6 billion. It was a house of cards built on a foundation of pure confidence. And at the center of this confidence were the great speculators, the market titans, men like Arthur Cutten. Arthur Cutten was a Canadian farm boy who came to Chicago and made a fortune in the grain market. But that wasn't big enough for him. He set his sights on Wall Street. He was a classic bull, a true believer in the new era of permanent prosperity. He was aggressive, he was brilliant, and by 1929, he was one of the most powerful players on the street, controlling a vast portfolio of stocks worth hundreds of millions of dollars. He was a hero of the age. But there were whispers of trouble. In September of 1929, the market took a sharp dip. It recovered, but the volatility was unnerving. It was like the first tremor before an earthquake. The roller coaster ride continued into October, a drop, then a recovery, another drop. The confidence was beginning to crack. Then came Thursday, October 24th, Black Thursday. The market opened and a wave of selling hit the floor. The ticker tape, the machine that printed out the stock prices, couldn't keep up. It fell further and further behind, so traders on the floor had no idea what the real prices were. All they knew was that they were falling. Panic began to set in. At noon, a group of the most powerful bankers in New York met at the offices of J.P. Morgan. They agreed to pool their resources and buy huge blocks of stock to stabilize the market. It was a show of force, a message to the world that the big money was still in control. And for a moment, it worked. The market rallied. The weekend papers were cautiously optimistic. The worst, it seemed, was over. But over that weekend, something broke. The fear that had been contained on Thursday spread across the country like a virus. All weekend, brokers' offices were flooded with sell orders, not from the big players, but from the little guys. The chauffeurs, the maids, the millions of ordinary people who had bet their life savings on the market. They wanted out, all of them, at any price. An eyewitness reporter, Jonathan Leonard, described the scene. Horrified brokers watched the selling orders accumulate. It wasn't a flood, it was a deluge. Everybody wanted to sell, the man with 5 shares and the man with 10,000. Monday, October 28th. The opening bell was a death knell. The selling was relentless. The banker's pool, which had seemed so powerful on Thursday, was helpless. It was like trying to stop a tsunami with a bucket. The market plunged. The Times Index dropped nearly 13% in a single day. Margin calls went out by the thousands. The house of cards was collapsing. That night, Wall Street was a scene of organized chaos. The lights in the great buildings burned all night as exhausted clerks tried to make sense of the day's carnage. But on the streets, a strange, manic energy took hold. A reporter wrote, "Messenger boys and runners raced through the streets whooping and singing at the tops of their lungs. Slum children invaded the district to play with balls of ticker tape. Well-dressed gentlemen fell asleep in lunch counters." It was the delirium of disaster. Everyone knew what was coming the next day, and it was worse than anyone could have imagined. Tuesday, October 29th, Black Tuesday, the day the world broke. From the moment the market opened, it was pure, unadulterated panic. In the first half hour, over 3 million shares were traded. The selling pressure was coming from everywhere. The wires from other cities, the cables from Europe, all screaming one word: sell. There were no buyers. At times, for major stocks like U.S. Steel, there was simply no one willing to make an offer at any price. On the floor of the stock exchange, it was bedlam. An observer described the scene. Traders hollered and screamed. They clawed at one another's collars. It was like a bunch of crazy men. Every once in a while, when radio or steel would take another tumble, you'd see some poor devil collapse and fall to the floor. By the end of the day, 16.4 million shares had been traded. It was a record that would stand for nearly 40 years. The market lost another 12% of its value. In total, $14 billion of wealth had vanished in one day. That's more than the entire cost of World War I for the United States. In the space of a few weeks, $30 billion would be wiped out, more than twice the entire national debt. For men like Arthur Cutten, the bull market genius, it was the end of the world. He was wiped out. The Toronto Daily Star called him the Samson who pulled down the pillars of the exchange. He would be investigated, barred from trading, and would die a few years later, a broken man charged with tax evasion. For William C. Durant, the founder of General Motors, a man who had built and lost and rebuilt fortunes, this was the final blow. He had been worth hundreds of millions. He declared bankruptcy in 1936, listing his assets as the clothes on his back, worth $200. He ended his life managing a bowling alley in Flint, Michigan, and the stories, the legends began to spread of millionaires ruined in an instant, leaping from their office windows. While the stories were largely exaggerated, there was no epidemic of suicides. They captured a horrifying truth. The dream of effortless wealth had become a nightmare. A few prominent figures did take their own lives, like James Riordan, the president of the County Trust Company, who shot himself in his home. His death was kept secret for a day to prevent a run on his bank. But for most, It was a quieter, more drawn-out kind of death, the death of a future they had taken for granted. And for the families of Millionaire's Row, the crash was the final merciless blow. The money that had allowed them to downsize from palaces to penthouses was now gone. The last vestiges of their Gilded Age fortunes, the paper wealth that had replaced the stone wealth, turned to dust. The party was well and truly over. So now we can see the full picture. The destruction of Millionaire's Row wasn't a single event. It was a 1-2 punch, a tragedy in 2 acts. The first act was a slow, quiet decline, driven by the unglamorous realities of taxes and maintenance. It was the logical end of an illogical way of life. The second act was the loud, spectacular, and violent finale of the 1929 crash. The crash didn't destroy the palaces. Most of them were already gone. It destroyed the fortunes that had built them. It wiped out the last of the great family empires that had treated Fifth Avenue as their personal monopoly board. It was the end of an entire class, an entire way of life. The Gilded Age, which had been dying for a decade, was now officially buried. But why was this tragedy forgotten? Why did the simple, powerful myth, the crash destroyed everything, take hold so firmly in the popular imagination? Perhaps because it's a better story. It's more dramatic, more satisfying. It has a clear villain, Wall Street greed, and a clear moment of reckoning. The real story is messier. It's a story about gradual change, about the slow, inevitable march of progress, about the unsustainability of extreme wealth in a modernizing democracy. It's less of a morality play and more of a complex historical process. Not everyone was ruined, of course. There were those who saw it coming. Joseph Kennedy, father of the future president, famously liquidated his stocks right before the crash, emerging from the chaos wealthier than ever. Some of the old families, whose wealth was tied up in land and trusts rather than speculative stocks, weathered the storm. But the world they had once ruled was gone forever. The Great Depression that followed the crash would usher in a new era of government regulation and social safety nets, a world fundamentally hostile to the kind of unchecked capitalism that had fueled the Gilded Age. And what of the palaces themselves? What is the legacy of Millionaire's Row? Most are just photographs in a book, ghosts on a street that has reinvented itself a dozen times over. But fragments remain, if you know where to look. The magnificent wrought iron gates of the Cornelius Vanderbilt II mansion, which once guarded the entrance to the largest home in New York, now stand at the entrance to the Conservatory Garden in Central Park, a public space for all to enjoy. A marble mantelpiece from the same house is on display at the Metropolitan Museum of Art, another public institution. A few of the great houses survived by transforming themselves. The Biltmore Estate in North Carolina, the grandest of all the Vanderbilt country homes, was opened to the public in 1930, a desperate attempt to generate tourist revenue during the Depression. The great mansions of Newport, Rhode Island, once the summer playground of the super-rich, were sold off one by one, becoming museums, their velvet ropes now keeping the public out of rooms that were once the stage for the most exclusive parties in the world. In the end, the story of Millionaire's Row is a quintessentially American story, a story of boundless ambition, of spectacular creation, and of equally spectacular destruction. It's a story about the tension between the democratic ideal and the aristocratic impulse. The men and women of the Gilded Age tried to build a permanent aristocracy in a country founded on the idea that nothing is permanent. They carved their names into stone, believing they would last for centuries. But in the end, the city, the country, and the economy moved on. The palaces they built were no match for the forces of history. And all that's left is the faint echo of a lost world, a whisper of a time when giants walked the earth and built their castles on an island of dreams, a forgotten tragedy hidden in plain sight on the most famous street in America. To truly grasp the cataclysm of the crash, we must first immerse ourselves in the decade that preceded it. The 1920s in America were not just a period of economic growth, they were a cultural revolution. The trauma of the First World War had given way to a frenetic, almost desperate pursuit of pleasure and modernity. This was the Jazz Age, the age of the flapper, the speakeasy, and the automobile. And at the heart of it all was an almost religious faith in the stock market. Before the 1920s, Wall Street was seen as a private club for the wealthy and connected. But the Liberty Bond drives of World War I had introduced millions of ordinary Americans to the idea of owning securities. After the war, this newfound financial literacy, combined with a booming economy, created a perfect storm. The stock market became democratized. It was no longer a club, it was a national pastime, and everyone wanted to play. Investment trusts and brokerage firms opened offices in small towns across the country. Newspapers, which had once relegated financial news to a few dense columns, now ran banner headlines proclaiming new market highs. Magazines published glowing profiles of market wizards, men who seemed to have a magic formula for turning paper into gold. Figures like Jesse Livermore, the boy plunger who had made and lost fortunes betting on market swings, became folk heroes. Their exploits were followed with the same breathless excitement as those of Babe Ruth or Charles Lindbergh. The very language of the market became part of the national conversation. People spoke of bulls and bears, of margins and pools. A pool was a particularly insidious invention of the era. A group of wealthy investors would secretly conspire to buy up a particular stock, driving its price up through their coordinated activity. As the price rose, they would plant favorable stories in the press, luring in the public. And once the unsuspecting masses had piled in, the pool operators would dump their shares at a massive profit, leaving the small investors holding the bag as the price collapsed. It was a rigged game, but in the giddy optimism of the 1920s, everyone believed they could be a winner. This speculative fever was fueled by an explosion of credit. Buy now, pay later became the mantra of the decade, not just for consumer goods like radios and refrigerators, but for stocks as well. Buying on margin allowed an investor to put down as little as 10% of a stock's price, borrowing the rest from their broker. As long as the stock price went up, this was a fantastic deal. A 10% rise in the stock's value could translate to a 100% return on the investor's cash. But if the stock fell, the losses were magnified just as dramatically. A small dip could wipe out the investor's entire initial investment and leave them deeply in debt to their broker. It was a system of breathtaking fragility, a skyscraper of debt built on a foundation of pure, unadulterated hope. And for a while, the hope seemed justified. From 1925 to 1929, the Dow Jones Industrial Average more than doubled. Stocks like Radio Corporation of America, RCA, seemed to defy gravity, soaring from $85 to $500 a share. Seemed, as one prominent economist famously declared just days before the crash, that stocks had reached what looks like a permanently high plateau. But there were warning signs for those who cared to look. The agricultural sector had been in a depression for most of the decade. Industrial production had begun to slow in the summer of 1929. The market itself had become increasingly volatile. But in the roar of the party, no one wanted to hear the bad news. The music was playing, the champagne was flowing, and no one believed it would ever stop. Until it did. The week that broke the world began with an eerie calm. After the initial shock of Black Thursday, the intervention of the banker's pool seemed to have worked. But beneath the surface, the pressure was building. The technology of the era was simply not equipped to handle the volume of selling that was about to be unleashed. The ticker tape, the thin ribbon of paper that printed stock prices, could only print so fast. The telephone and telegraph lines that connected New York to the rest of the country and the world were already strained. On Black Monday, the system began to buckle. As the wave of sell orders hit, the ticker fell hopelessly behind. By the end of the day, it was running nearly 2 hours late. This created a terrifying information vacuum. Investors across the country had no idea what their stocks were worth. They only knew the last price they had seen, hours ago, was lower than the one before. The fear fed on itself, creating a feedback loop of pure panic. An investor in California, seeing that his stock was down 5 points an hour ago, would send a telegram to his broker, "Sell at any price." By the time the order was executed, the stock might be down 20 points, but the order would go through, adding to the downward pressure. On Black Tuesday, the system completely shattered. The volume of trading was so immense, 16.4 million shares, a number that was simply incomprehensible at the time, that the ticker didn't finish printing the day's trades until 7:45 that evening, more than 4 hours after the market had closed. For those 4 hours, the financial world was flying blind. The men on the floor of the exchange were the only ones who had any sense of the scale of the disaster, and what they saw was a vision of hell. The floor of the New York Stock Exchange, normally a place of controlled chaos, devolved into a screaming mob. The elegant wood-paneled boardrooms of brokerage houses, where gentlemen once calmly smoked cigars and watched the prices climb, became scenes of despair. Men wept openly. Others simply stared in stunned silence at the numbers that represented their life's work, their family's future, vanishing into thin air. The human cost was immediate and devastating. The myth of stockbrokers leaping from windows is just that, a myth. But the psychological toll was very real. The crash didn't just destroy wealth, it destroyed identities. These were men who had seen themselves as masters of the universe, geniuses of the new economic era. In the space of a few days, they were revealed to be gamblers who had lost everything. The shame was as profound as the financial loss. And for the great families of Millionaires Row, the crash represented the final ignominious end of their Gilded Age dream. They had already abandoned their palaces, but they had clung to their fortunes. Now that too was gone. The Vanderbilt family, whose name was once synonymous with unimaginable wealth, saw their vast holdings in railroad stocks decimated. Other families, who had diversified into the popular new technology stocks, were wiped out completely. The slow decline that had begun with the income tax had ended in a sudden, brutal, and public execution. The forgotten tragedy was complete. The ghosts of Fifth Avenue now had company, the ghosts of fortunes that had once seemed as solid as the stone castles they had built.